Welcome. Here we are at our fifth and final session for this iteration of CrossPaths, as we've been studying contemporary prophets, biblical and otherwise. Now, I thought it would be great to close this series with a blockbuster, eye-opening, wildly inspirational large group tonight. But neither Pastor Brenda nor Pastor Aaron were available, so wait a second. Jose? Alex? Well, I guess not. We'll just have to make do. So, for us, I believe it is most fitting to conclude a study of the biblical prophets with a look at Jesus. Now, clearly, we understand Jesus not only to be the Word made flesh, but also the voice of God made audible. Jesus, God's Son, our Savior, also known as our teacher, healer, advocate, and prophet. There's a key story in the Gospels that brings Jesus, Moses, and Elijah together on a mountaintop. It's a decisive moment in the ministry and in our understanding of Jesus. We often refer to it as the Transfiguration story. In Jewish tradition, Moses and Elijah hold an exalted place among the biblical prophets, while Moses is often said to be the greatest of all prophets, vastly more written about him. Elijah has to be seen to be a close second, revered and looked to as one of the greatest of all time. Now, here's how that Transfiguration story goes. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Peter says to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them. And from the cloud a voice came that said, "This is my Son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground. They were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. Students of the Gospels refer to this story told in Matthew, Mark, and Luke as a hinge story. It connects Jesus' ministry prior to the road to Jerusalem and the road to the final days of Jesus' life, his death on the cross. For the original audience of Matthew's story, this was not just a cool Jesus and 2 dead dudes, but it was an OMG moment. You might say the moment that they and their ancestors had long been waiting for. The moment when past and present and future came together, and there could be no doubt. The Messiah had come. They would say that it was just as the rabbis had taught for years, that Elijah would return to prepare the way for the Messiah, to lead the victory march. Elijah once again on a mountain encountering his God. And Moses too. Moses on yet another mountain with a cloud overhead and the voice of God booming guidance and instruction. And of course Jesus, his face changed, transfigured. His clothes a dazzling white, his face shining. And as I shared a couple weeks ago, Luke says in his telling of the story that the 3 of them were talking about Jesus' departure. Greek word, exodus. The departure that was to take place on a cross outside of Jerusalem. In session 3, we studied the prophet Moses and how God spoke through him to rally, to encourage, to challenge, and guide God's people in a very critical time in their history. Before we go on to discuss further the significance of this Transfiguration story we just read, let's learn a little bit about that prophet Elijah. What we know is that Elijah the prophet comes from a small town in the region of Gilead, a mountainous area east of the Jordan, now in present-day Jordan. We know nothing about his previous life. We know nothing about his occupation. He just shows up. And his story begins in 1 Kings 17, where we read of him in the court of King Ahab of Israel. Now, of course, some context will always be helpful. After the death of King Solomon, the nation of Israel becomes divided into north and south because the 12 tribes couldn't agree who should be king. The 10 northern tribes retained the name Israel. The 2 southern tribes take the name Judah, each with their own king. Judah is the poorer, weaker of the 2, but it retains the capital city of Jerusalem. The northern kingdom chooses Samaria to be its capital, insisting that it, and not Jerusalem, is the place where true worship of God will be found. Because of its wealth and strength relative to Judah, Israel often found itself at the top of a short list of desirable nations to conquer. So, King Omri of Israel sought to strengthen his position. He made an arranged marriage between his son Ahab and the daughter of a powerful king of Sidon in the area of Phoenicia. The woman's name was Jezebel. When Ahab takes over as king, Jezebel sought to solidify the prominence of her god Baal, by bringing with her an entourage of Baal priests, Baal prophets. And King Ahab even builds a temple just for them. He tried to appease both the Israelites and his wife by encouraging both religions. Now Elijah confronts Ahab's mixed allegiances. He states that there will be neither dew nor rain for years in Israel because of it, and there is nothing that this so-called rain god, Baal, can do about it. Drought strikes. And for 3 years, there is no rain. For 3 years, Elijah remains in hiding while the prophets of Baal pray day after day for rain, with no results. During that time, we read that God provides food and water for Elijah in the wilderness, just as God had in the Exodus with Moses. There's an important encounter that Elijah makes in that wilderness with a widow and with her son in a place called Zarephath, where the mother and son are down to their last little bit of meal in a jar and a tiny little oil in a jug. And they're about to make it into their last supper together. And they're just waiting to die. Elijah shows up, asks her to share with him this meal. And miraculously, the meal and the oil are replenished. Day after day after day, they never run out. And then when the widow's son dies, Elijah prays that God will bring him back to life so Elijah can give him to his mother. And God does so. Now remember, Jesus feeding the 5,000. Jesus turning water into an endless supply of wine. Jesus raising another widow's son from death. And how people would wonder, what is this connection between Elijah and Jesus? Some even said Jesus was Elijah returned. Well, when Elijah is told by God to return and confront Ahab after those 3 years in the wilderness, 3 years of drought, he says to the gathered people in 1 Kings 18, "How long are you going to limp around with your indecision? Should we worship Baal or should we worship the God of Israel? Just how did your rain God do in his last performance evaluation?" But the people would not answer Elijah. So Elijah proposes a competition. He says, "Summon all 450 priests of Baal to meet me and bring 2 bulls for sacrifices, 1 for them, 1 for me. A little competition. We'll each prepare the bull and the wood for a fire and a sacrifice. And we'll each call out to our gods to send fire from heaven to consume the bull bites." "You get to go first," Elijah said. So we read that the priests of Baal did. They cut up the bull into bull bites, placed the bull bites onto the dry wood, called out to Baal again and again. Let's read the story. They took the bull that was given them, prepared it, and called on the name of Baal from morning until noon, crying out, "O Baal, answer us!" But there was no voice and no answer. They limped around the altar that had been made. At noon, Elijah mocked them, saying, "Cry louder. Surely he's a god. Maybe he's meditating, or he's wandered away, or maybe he's on a journey, or perhaps he's asleep and needs to be awakened." Then they cried even louder, and as was their custom, they cut themselves with swords and lances until blood gushed out from them. As midday passed, they raved on until the time of the offering of the oblation, but there was no voice, no answer, and no response. Well, Elijah at that point says to the crowd, "Come closer." He builds an altar out of a pile of stones, has them dig a trench around the altar, stacks the wood on the altar for the fire, places all of the bull bits on the wood, and then says, "Wait a minute. Before I ask God to send the fire, bring me some water and let's soak the wood." They do. And he says, "Do it again." And they do. And then he says, "One more soak for good measure." And when they're finished pouring water on the wood is soaked. The trench around the altar filled with water. Now, Elijah says, "Watch this." Elijah comes near and says, "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your bidding. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, so that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back." Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering, the wood, the stones, even the dust, and even licked up all the water that was in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and said, "The Lord indeed is God. The Lord indeed is God." Elijah says to them, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Do not let one of them escape." And they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the Wadi Kishon and killed them there. Quite a story. Well, you can imagine that this doesn't play well with Queen Jezebel. She sends a messenger to Elijah saying, "By this time tomorrow, you're a dead man." And Elijah runs away, runs into the wilderness, tells God that he just wishes to die. Now, I hope at some point you read the whole story in 1 Kings 18 and 19, but I do want to share one of my favorite parts of this drama. Not just once, but twice this time, God has come to tell Elijah to quit his pity party, to get off his butt, get back to being God's prophet. In the second encounter, which takes place on Mount Horeb, which is also called Mount Sinai, where Moses once saw a burning bush and later was handed the 10 Commandments, God calls out to Elijah, and God says, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now, there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard that, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you still doing here, Elijah?" You might ask if it was then that Elijah got the idea of putting together a musical group called Earthquake, Wind, and Fire. Or maybe writing the lyrics for the sound of silence. Well, we'll never know. What we do know is that Elijah gets up. Elijah goes back to work. He is far from done. Our God, who sometimes speaks and is made known in the deep silences of life says go. And despite his fear, his anxiety, despite the danger and the threat, all those things that lead us to yearn for a God who would send down fire from the heavens, reducing those fears to ash, fear, anxiety, danger, and threat, praying for a dramatic intervention. Sometimes God is in the silence. Silence, brimming over with God's presence, brimming over with God's assurance that the road ahead is shared, it's sacred, it's supported with divine grace. So, back to our transfiguration story, back to Jesus, Moses, and Elijah on the mountain. As Peter, James, and John look on, they see Elijah and Moses, prophets extraordinaire, who brought God's voice to a people trying to figure out what it means to be God's people. They realize that this is a people whose loyalty and faithfulness always seem to ebb and flow, wax and wane, rise and fall, again and again and again. Here it is, Elijah and Moses with Jesus. It's like looking at the who's who of prophets in Israel. And as they're looking on, a voice from above says, "This is my son, listen to him." And in a moment, Jesus alone remains. Now, before that voice comes, before Elijah and Moses disappear, Peter, James, and John recognize that this is a once-in-a-lifetime moment that they wanted to preserve. Peter suggests building 3 shelters for these 3 prophets and camping out there indefinitely. 3 tabernacles, to be precise. And if you remember from our Moses lecture, the word tabernacle not only described the place that Moses would go to meet God face to face, but also described the dwelling place, the abiding place that Jesus said he would make in you, in us, and where you would abide in him. Peter, as he has done before, seeks to keep Jesus right where he is, resisting the inevitable return back into the chaos and the danger of the world below. Peter suggesting that they build 3 shelters and stay right there. But as we learn, it was not to be, because for Jesus, the miracle on the mountain is not that they could be looking at his dazzling light, but that they could go down the mountain and look with the light, and bring the light, and reflect the light into God's world, into the shadows. And from that day forward, they did. One of my favorite quotes from C.S. Lewis is that there's a huge difference in being a church that comes to look at Christ and one that seeks to look with him. There's a monumental difference in the life of the one who looks at faith and one who looks with faith. When we look with faith, we are what we are, and it's an accurate assessment. We're faulty and guilty, but we're forgiven and free. We're saint and we're sinner, woven together. We're light of the world, salt of the earth, children of the Heavenly Father, branches of the vine, learning and bearing the fruit of the Spirit. More than being a simple assessment of what is, what we hear is this is a vision of what we're baptized to be. We are what we are, but we're also transformed, transfigured. No longer butts parked in a pew, but we're people driven back down the mountain to look with Christ's light, to look with faith at the days, the people, the needs unfolding ahead of us. The disciples knew that from that mountaintop moment with Jesus, everything was about to change. And who can blame Peter for wanting to go no further? He would soon discover that there would be resistance, there would be opposition, risks, dangers ahead in following Jesus, because there's a deep-seated fear of those who were not willing to see, who did not desire or believe in the need to change, to turn from self-will to God's will. Lord, maybe we should just stay here, Peter wondered. And we do. Of course we do as well. Maybe we could just stay here. Maybe we could just stay in the sanctuary. Maybe we could just go on looking at faith, singing about hope, praying for the world to change around us. Maybe we should just stay here in this place, resigned to the fact that we are what we are and that tomorrow is just today warmed over. Groundhog's Day. Or perhaps we have been challenged to look with faith, to look with and reflect God's light, to pray for the serenity, courage, and wisdom to be the change that we hope and God desires to see. When we were considering as a team contemporary prophets to pair up with this transfiguration story, one who immediately came to mind for us was Mother Teresa. She is, as you know, a woman of relatively few words who refused to see faith as a mountaintop love fest with Jesus, but who every day lived at the foot of the mountain, holding the feet, feeding bodies and souls of those who'd been discarded and devalued, holding the dying on the streets of Calcutta. We asked one of our youth, Sage Butita, some of what she learned, what she knows about Mother Teresa, and to share it with us. Let's listen to Sage.
If you judge people, you have no time to love them. That is a famous quote from Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa was a Christian nun who was born in Macedonia in Eastern Europe, but lived most of her life in India, where she founded the Missionaries of Charity and devoted her life to helping the poor. She received many awards, including the Nobel Peace Prize. Mother Teresa was so inspirational because she loved and cared for everybody, trying to make the poorest of the poorest people's life better. She was very selfless and compassionate towards all people. She always put others in front of herself. That is why I find Mother Teresa so inspiring.
Thank you, Sage. Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa, like Elijah, experienced the power of silence. And she wrote once that the fruit of silence is prayer. The fruit of prayer is faith. The fruit of faith is love. And the fruit of love is service. The fruit of service, finally, peace. She also said, if your heart is full of worldly things, you cannot hear the voice of God. But when you have listened to the voice in the silence of your heart, then your heart is filled. Then from the fullness of the heart, the mouth will speak. What we do know is that Mother Teresa did not always do well with God's silence. She struggled, as many of us do, with a silence that sometimes left her feeling very alone, even though surrounded by thousands of people. And after her death, some of Mother Teresa's private letters to her church superiors, which she pleaded to have them destroy, were published. And it revealed this side of her that never was allowed for the world to see. She writes that for the last 50 years of her life, she struggled with what she felt was the absence of God, the silence of God. She often felt abandoned, alone, and questioned her faith. Sometimes she felt like she'd lost the love and enthusiasm for her work. She even thought herself a hypocrite, teaching one thing while feeling the opposite. And for some, her writings about this darkness in her soul were troubling, was confusing, was heartbreaking. For some who salivate over hearing of a Christian's questions and doubts, it was just more evidence for them of the foolhardiness of discipleship, proof of God's fictitiousness. It further fortified their rejection of faith and of Christianity. But for those who know of Jesus' prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, who heard and have read of Jesus' cries from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Who have read of Paul's writings in 2 Corinthians 7:5, where he talks about feeling harassed, tormented from outside and by fears within. Or maybe who have read of Martin Luther's torment and thinking he could never be worthy of God's love or care. We know that faith isn't the absence of feeling God's absence, nor the joy of perpetual joy. Faith is not characterized by a lack of anxiety or fear or the removal of all threat. Faith, we learn in the story, is coming down the mountain with Jesus into the fray, coming down into the lives of those fraught with hurt, sorrow, and the sting of pain. Faith sometimes maybe faith all times, is going forward to wash feet, to feed, to comfort, to forgive and companion, even when God is silent. Mother Teresa spent her life caring for the sick, for the dying, the poorest of the poor, the unwanted, the unvalued, those souls who had been kicked to the curb of life and left to die there. In Isaiah, we read about the servant of God who suffers for the sake of God's people. It's a passage that would later hold up alongside Jesus to describe his ministry. It says, "Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases. Yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole. And by his bruises, we are healed." Isaiah 53. Perhaps, and I say perhaps, if we have never wondered or experienced the dark night of the soul, it's because we refuse to come down the mountain with Jesus and face the reality of a world where shadows and darkness are all too real and all too entrenched. Perhaps, and I say perhaps, Mother Teresa's private letters were private confessions and reflect what happens when a deeply empathetic soul is overwhelmed and overflows with the suffering and the sadness and the callousness in human life. Jesus once cried over the city of Jerusalem, grieved the reputation it had as a city that both kills the prophets and stones them, stones those sent to it by God. A city that, despite God's every effort, refused to gather under God's wings. Perhaps, and I say perhaps, the stronger our efforts to deny or defend or dispute the entrenchment of sin in structures, systems, and souls, it's because our fears and our urge for self-preservation are more powerful than our courage, deeper than our compassion. In the beginning was the Word, it says in John 1. And in the beginning, it was God's voice that brought order out of chaos, created light in the midst of darkness, brought life out of emptiness, brought relationships out of loneliness. In Jesus, the Word and the voice that has been passed on to us, pointed to by the prophets, came to us in all of its fullness and said, first to the 12, now to you, follow me. Follow me, Jesus said, into the world's silences and in its incessant noises. Bring forward my voice and advocate, give voice to my will. Advocate, give voice to God's love and God's grace, and be the prophet that you have been called to be. Thanks. Thanks for joining us for these sessions of CrossPaths and our look at contemporary prophets. God's blessing, God's peace.